She found her husband's secret ledgers. She made copies. She rode for Helena with everything she needed to put him away. And she almost made it. 2 days from the border, his men caught up with her. They took the evidence. They took everything. And then they left her in the road to bleed out alone under a Montana sun. What they didn't know is that she had already made copies of the copies. This channel tells the stories the West is famous for, not just the gunfights and the glory, but the deeper things. A cowboy's loyalty, a mother's sacrifice, the way a single act of human kindness can rewrite a person's entire future. The truth this story carries. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding the people at the end of those wagon trails matter more than your own survival. Like this video if it hit home. Share it, someone out there needs this story today. And subscribe, because we're just getting started.
The first thing Caleb Mercer saw were the buzzards, 3 of them circling low over the trail about a quarter-mile up ahead. They were patient, the way only creatures that work for death can be. He reined in his chestnut mare and narrowed his eyes against the afternoon sun. "Easy now, Juniper," he said, soft-like, patting her neck. "Probably just a coyote that met its maker." But something deep in his gut told him that was wrong. 3 years of running a ranch outside Elk Bend had taught him to listen to that feeling. He made the mistake of ignoring it once back in Kansas. He swore he would never do that again. He urged Juniper on. The woman was lying face down right in the middle of the trail. One of her arms was stretched out like she had been trying to crawl somewhere. Her dress, or what was left of it, was torn up into rags. Her dark hair, all matted with blood and dirt, was fanned out on the ground. She was not moving at all. Caleb was off his horse before Juniper even came to a full stop. He knelt down beside her, his hands just hovering, scared that touching her would cause even more harm. "Ma'am?" His voice came out all scratchy. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" There was nothing. He gently pressed 2 fingers against her neck. He found a pulse. It was weak and fluttery, but it was there. He let out a long breath he did not even realize he was holding. All right. You are alive." He turned her over onto her back as gentle as he knew how. What he saw made his stomach turn over. Her face was a ruin. The left eye was swollen completely shut. Her lips were split open deep enough to need stitches. She had bruises on top of other bruises. Some were a fresh, angry purple. Others were already that ugly yellow-green color, which meant they were days old. This was not from a single beating. Somebody had been hurting this woman for a very long time. And it looked like today they had decided to finish the job for good. Her fingers were broken. At least 3 of them on her right hand were bent at angles they should not be. She had tried to defend herself. She had fought. "Good for you," Caleb whispered to her. "You fought back." He took his bandana, wet it with water from his canteen, and gently touched it to her cracked lips. A small sound came out of her, not quite a moan, but more like the whimper of a wounded animal. Her one good eye cracked open. It was unfocused and wild with pure terror. She tried to jerk away from him. That little bit of movement sent a wave of pain through her whole body, and she cried out, curling in on herself. "Do not," she rasped out. "Do not touch me. Please do not." "I am not going to hurt you." Caleb held both of his hands up where she could see them, with his palms open. "My name is Caleb Mercer. I have got a ranch about 4 miles from here. I am just trying to help you." Her eyes stared hard at his face, trying to find the lie in his words. He had seen that same look in horses that had been mistreated by their owners. Their trust was so shattered it felt like it might never come back. "You hear me, ma'am? Nobody is hurting you anymore." "Leave me," she whispered. "Just leave me here." "I cannot do that." "I said, leave me," her voice cracked. I am not worth the trouble. Those words hit Caleb like a punch square in the chest. Not worth the trouble. Somebody had taught her to believe that. Somebody had beaten that belief right into her, along with all those bruises. Well, ma'am, I reckon that is not for you to decide right now. He kept his voice low and steady, the same way he talked to a spooked horse. I am going to pick you up and put you on my horse. It is going to hurt, and I am sorry for that. But I am not leaving you out here for the buzzards. She just stared at him for a long moment. Then something inside her just broke. Not in a bad way, but like a dam finally bursting. Tears started to cut clean paths through the dirt and blood on her face. They will come back, she whispered. They will come back, and they will kill you too. Well, they can sure try. He slid one arm under her shoulders and the other under her knees. When he lifted her up, she let out a short, bitten-off scream, the kind that told him she had a lot of practice swallowing her pain. He held her against his chest and felt her whole body shaking like a leaf in a high wind. I know it hurts, he said quietly. Just try to hold on. Getting her up onto Juniper was not easy. She was barely even conscious by the time he got on behind her. He wrapped one arm around her waist just to keep her from falling. Her head lolled back against his shoulder. What is your name? He asked as they started moving slow. Maggie, she breathed out. And then she said nothing more. The ride to Pine Ridge Ranch took almost an hour because of the careful pace Caleb had to keep. Maggie came to twice during the ride. Both times she started thrashing and crying out names he did not know. And both times he just held her a little tighter and talked her through it, his voice low and calm. You are safe, Maggie. Nobody is going to get to you. Just breathe. Tom Whitfield saw them coming first. The young ranch hand dropped the fence rail he was carrying and came running. His face turned pale as a sheet when he saw the woman in Caleb's arms. Good Lord, boss, what happened? Found her on the trail. She's been beaten something terrible. Go get Ruth. Ruth is already at the house. She brought some supper over. Good. Tell her to get the spare room ready. We need hot water, clean cloths, whatever she thinks she needs. Tom took off for the house at a dead run. By the time Caleb made it to the porch, Ruth Calloway was already standing in the doorway. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, and her face had that hard, determined look it always got when something needed to be done right now. At 58 years old, Ruth had buried a husband, built up a business, and seen more hardship than most men could handle. Not much could shake her. But when Caleb carried Maggie inside, even Ruth's steady calm seemed to crack a little. Lord have mercy, she breathed. Put her in the back room, gently now. I know, Ruth. Her fingers are broken. I can see that. And those bruises are not all new. Some of them are a week old, maybe even older. I know. Ruth's jaw set tight. Who did this to her? I do not know yet. She said they, so it was more than one. He laid Maggie down on the bed more carefully than he had ever done anything in his whole life. She moaned, and her good eye fluttered open again. Where? She started to ask. My ranch, Caleb told her. You are safe here. Ruth moved to the side of the bed, her hands gentle but businesslike as she started to see how bad the damage was. Sweetheart, I need to check your ribs. It is going to hurt. You squeeze my hand if you need to. Maggie's eyes darted back and forth between Ruth and Caleb, still full of fear. This is Ruth Calloway, Caleb said. She runs the best kitchen in Elk Bend, and I swear she is tougher than anyone I've ever met. You're in good hands. Ruth shot him a look. Get out now. I'll be right outside the door. You will be in the kitchen making yourself useful. Boil some more water and send Tom for Dr. Price. Hannah is 30 miles away. Then Tom had better ride fast. Ruth turned back to Maggie, her voice turning soft in an instant. Now, sweetheart, let us just see what they did to you. Caleb left the room, but he did not go far. He stood right there in the hallway, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He listened to Ruth's soft, murmuring words and Maggie's sharp little gasps of breath. Every sound of her pain twisted something up inside his chest that he had spent 3 years trying to keep locked away. He had left Kansas to get away from this very thing, from violence, from broken people he could not fix, from the guilt of showing up too late. And now it had found him again, right on his own trail. Tom showed up at the end of the hall, holding his hat in his hands. "Boss, you want me to ride for Dr. Price?" "Yeah, ride hard. Tell her it is bad." "What happened to her?" "Someone tried to kill her, Tom. That is what happened." The young man's face went hard. "I will be back with the doc by morning." He turned to leave, but then he stopped. "Should I go get the sheriff?" Caleb thought for a second. Maggie's words came back to him. "They will come back. They will kill you too." Whoever did this to her, she was absolutely terrified of them. Bringing Sheriff Yates into this before he knew the whole story might just put her in even more danger. "No, not yet. Just go get Hannah." Tom nodded and was gone. An hour later, Ruth came out of the bedroom. She closed the door softly behind her, and for the first time since Caleb had known the woman, she looked like she was about to cry. "How bad is it?" he asked. 4 broken ribs, 3 broken fingers. She's got bruises all over her arms, her back, her legs. Her lip needs stitches, but I did the best I could. That left eye of hers, I just do not know if she will ever see right out of it again." Ruth stopped for a moment. "And the old bruises, Caleb. She has been beaten before many times. This was not the first time." "I figured as much." "There is something else," Ruth said, lowering her voice. "She has got rope burns around her wrists. They tied her up before they did all this." Caleb's hands balled into fists again, so tight he could feel his nails digging into his palms. He turned away and stared at the wall, his jaw working back and forth. "Did she say anything?" he asked. "A name. Douglas. She kept saying, 'Douglas, please stop,' over and over again." Ruth wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Caleb, whoever this Douglas is, that woman is scared of him down to her very bones. This was not just some robbery that went bad. This was personal." "Her husband," Caleb said. "That would be my guess. The way she said the name, you do not say a stranger's name like that. That is how you beg someone you once loved to stop hurting you." The silence that fell between them was heavy as a stone. "She can stay as long as she needs to," Caleb said. "Of course she can." But Ruth just pinned him with a hard stare. "If the person who did this comes looking for her, you know what that means for you? For this ranch? I know what it means. Do you? Because 3 years ago you came to Montana to get away from trouble. You told me yourself you were done with guns and done with fighting. I was wrong." Ruth studied him for a long, quiet moment, then gave a slow nod. "Good, because that girl in there needs somebody who is not going to run." She turned toward the kitchen. "I will make some broth. She is going to need to eat when she wakes up." Maggie woke up in the dark. For one awful second, she was back in the wagon, her hands tied, hearing Virgil Kane's cold voice telling her they were going somewhere nobody would ever find the body. Then the pain slammed into her, real and immediate, grounding her. She remembered the trail, the cowboy, and his arms lifting her up. She was lying in a bed with clean sheets and a quilt that smelled of lavender and cedar. Moonlight coming through a window showed a simple room with wood walls, a dresser, and a chair. And in that chair sat the cowboy, Caleb. He was fast asleep, his chin resting on his chest with a rifle laid across his lap. He was standing guard over her. The realization struck her so powerfully she almost cried out. She pressed her good hand to her mouth to stay quiet, but a choked sound slipped out anyway. It was something halfway between a gasp and a sob. Caleb's eyes flew open in an instant. His hand tightened on the rifle, then relaxed when he saw her looking at him. You are awake, he said softly. How is the pain? Why are you in here, she asked, ignoring his question. Somebody has to keep watch. You do not even know who I am. I do not need to. You have no idea what I have done. What they claim I have done. Caleb leaned forward, putting his elbows on his knees. All right, then. What is it they say you have done? Maggie looked away from him. The moonlight shined on the tears streaming down her face. My husband, Douglas Colulton, he is a merchant back in Missouri. She stopped, then started over. He has been selling whiskey to the reservations illegally, poisoning people. I found his account books with dates, names, amounts, all of it, and you confronted him about it. A bitter laugh escaped her throat. I was foolish enough to believe he would stop, that he would actually listen to me, his own wife. What happened then? He broke my arm. That was the first time. She said it so flatly, like she was talking about the weather. After that, it happened any time I brought it up. A black eye one time, a cracked rib the next. He told me if I ever said a single word to anyone, he would claim I was a part of it, that I helped him. He said no court in the land would believe a woman over her husband. So you ran. I took the ledgers, copies of everything. I was on my way to take them to the federal marshal in Helena. Her voice cracked. I almost made it. 2 days out from Missouri, his men caught up with me. Virgil Kane and another man I did not recognize. They took the ledgers from me, they beat me, and they threw me in a wagon. She went quiet. And left you on the trail for dead, Caleb finished for her. Virgil wanted to just shoot me. The other one said that Douglas wanted me alive. They argued about it. Virgil hit me again, and I did not hear anything after that. She gently touched her swollen eye. I woke up lying in the dirt. They were gone. I just figured Virgil won the argument and decided not to waste a bullet. Caleb was silent for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was level, but she could feel the anger simmering just beneath it, like a river under a sheet of ice. Your husband sent men to kill you over some account books, over money. That whiskey business brings in thousands. If those records get to the marshal, Douglas loses it all. His business, his reputation, his freedom. She turned to look Caleb straight in the eye. That is exactly why you have to let me go. As soon as I can walk, I have to disappear. If Douglas finds out that you helped me, let him find out. You do not understand. The man has money. He has powerful friends. And Virgil Kane is... She shuddered. Virgil does not just follow orders. He enjoys his work. You saw what he did to me, and that was him holding back. I have dealt with men like Virgil Kane before. Not like this one, not... She pushed herself up onto one elbow, wincing in pain. Mr. Mercer, I am trying to save your life. Why will you not listen to me? Because I spent the last 3 years listening to that voice telling me not to get involved. He met her gaze. The last time I listened to that voice, a family in Kansas ended up dead because I showed up too late. I am not going to make that same mistake again. His words hung in the air between them. What happened in Kansas? Maggie asked in a soft voice. That is a story for another time. He stood up, leaning the rifle against the wall. You need to get some rest. Dr. Price will be here in the morning. She is good. One of the best. A woman doctor is the only kind to have. He started for the door. There is some water on the table next to you. Ruth left some broth warming on the stove. Are you hungry? Maggie shook her head, then changed her mind. Maybe just a little. When he came back with the broth, she saw his hands. They were large and rough from ranch work, but they were steady and gentle as he held the cup for her. She could not use her broken fingers, and accepting his help meant letting him get close, closer than any man had been since Douglas. She flinched when his hand brushed against hers. Sorry, she whispered. Do not you apologize for that, not ever. She took slow sips of the broth, watching him over the cup's rim. You are not what I expected. What did you expect? I do not know. Not this. Not. She tried to find the word. Kindness. A look flickered across his face. Maybe it was pain, or maybe recognition. Kindness is not supposed to be special, Maggie. It is supposed to be the normal way of things. Somebody just taught you different. She put the broth down and looked at him. I mean, really looked at him for the first time. He had brown eyes that were warm, but held their own shadows. There was a scar on his chin and lines around his mouth that came from clenching his jaw too often. This was not a man who was a stranger to damage himself. You lost someone, she said. It was not a question. Get some sleep, Maggie. Caleb. He paused in the doorway. Thank you for not just riding on by. He was quiet for a second. That was not an option, he said. Then he pulled the door nearly closed, leaving it open just a crack, and went back to his chair in the hallway. Maggie lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the crickets chirping, a horse moving around in the barn, the old house groaning as it settled. For the first time in months, she was not listening for the sound of footsteps. She was not planning escape routes. She was not bracing herself for a hit. She was just lying in a clean bed in a stranger's house, aching all over, with a man she had known for only a few hours sitting guard right outside her door with a rifle on his knees. It was not safety. Not yet. She had learned the hard way that safety was a lie men told you right before they proved it was not true. But it was something. Caleb did not sleep. He sat in that hallway chair until the dawn started to turn the windows gray with the rifle across his lap, listening to every single sound. Twice he heard Maggie cry out in her sleep. They were short, sharp noises that sliced through the quiet house like a knife. Both times he gripped the stock of the rifle until his knuckles turned white. But he did not go in. She did not need another man barging through her door uninvited. What she needed was to know that the door would stay shut, unless she was the one who wanted it open. At first light, Ruth came in with fresh biscuits and a look on her face that said she had not slept much either. How is she doing? Ruth asked, placing the basket on the kitchen table. She woke up once, had a little broth. She is scared, Ruth. Scared in a way that goes clear down to the bone. Did she tell you what happened? Her husband, a merchant from Missouri named Douglas Colulton. She found out he was running whiskey to the reservations. When she tried to make him stop, he turned on her. He sent his men to finish the job. Ruth's hand froze on the biscuit basket. Her own husband. She had proof. Ledgers that proved everything. His men took them back from her. So she has got nothing. She has got nothing. And he has every reason in the world to make sure she stays silent for good. Ruth sat down across the table from him, her look changing from sympathy to something much harder. Caleb, if this man has the kind of money and influence she is talking about, Elk Bend is not a big enough place to hide her. Sooner or later, someone is going to show up asking questions. I know. And you know what happens to people who get in between a powerful man and the thing he wants? I said, I know, Ruth. She held his gaze. So what are you planning on doing right now? Keep her alive. Get Hannah over here to fix the things I cannot. And after that, he rubbed the back of his neck. She needs to get those ledgers back. Without any proof, it is just her word against his. And she is right about one thing. No court is going to take a wife's word over her husband's, not without solid evidence. You are talking about going against a man who has already tried to have her killed. I am talking about doing the right thing. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and laid her hand over his. You remind me so much of my Henry. God rest his soul. He had that same stubborn streak, that same fool notion that one good man could stand up against the whole world. Did it work out for Henry? They shot him down in his own barn over water rights. Ruth's voice was completely steady, but her eyes were shining. But he died knowing he never once turned his back on someone who needed his help. And I have never, not for 1 second, been ashamed of him for it. She gave his hand a squeeze. You do what you have to do. I will make sure that girl stays fed and breathing. A noise from the back of the house made both of them turn. Maggie was standing in the hallway, leaning hard against the wall with her good hand braced on the doorframe. She was pale and swaying a little, but the look in her one good eye was fierce. "I heard y'all talking," she said. "About those ledgers. You ought to be in bed," Caleb said. "I ought to be dead." She took a slow, painful step into the room. "But I am not. And I need y'all to listen to me." Ruth started to get up, ready to help her, but Maggie lifted her broken hand. The movement stopped Ruth in her tracks and cost Maggie a fresh wave of pain. The ledgers his men carried off, those were just copies. A faint smile touched her swollen face. "My daddy was a banker, Mr. Mercer. I learned a long time ago to always make copies of the copies." Caleb just stared at her. "You have another set hidden somewhere. Before I even left Missouri, I put a package in the mail. I sent it to the only person I trust west of the Mississippi River." She glanced at Ruth, then her eyes went back to Caleb. "A doctor in Montana Territory. A woman by the name of Hannah Price." The name hit the quiet kitchen like a bolt of lightning. Ruth lowered herself back into her chair, real slow. Caleb's mouth fell open, then shut, then opened again. "Hannah Price," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The doctor I just sent Tom to go get. You know her." Maggie's good eye grew wide. "She is our town doctor. She is on her way to this very house right now." For a long second, not a soul said a word. Then Maggie's legs gave out from under her. Caleb was there to catch her before she hit the wood floor. And this time, for the very first time, she did not pull away from his touch. She held onto his shirt with her broken fingers, not even minding the pain. And she looked right up at him with something in her eyes he could not quite figure out. It was relief. It was disbelief. It was something that felt like the first tiny seed of hope she had let herself feel in a very long time. "Maybe God has not given up on me after all," she whispered. Caleb helped her settle into a chair while Ruth rushed to pour a glass of water. Outside, the July sun was just beginning to climb over the big Montana mountains. And somewhere on the road between that ranch and Helena, Tom Whitfield was riding as fast as he could toward a doctor. A doctor who had no idea she was carrying the very proof that could save a woman's life or get every last one of them killed. Tom Whitfield rode through the main gate around noon the next day, covered in dust and looking hollow-eyed from riding all through the night. Dr. Hannah Price was right beside him on a gray horse, her doctor's bag tied down behind her saddle. Her face was serious and calm, the look of a woman who knew a long time ago that getting panicked never saved anybody. Caleb met them out in the yard. "Thank you for coming, Hannah. Tom said it was pretty bad." Hannah swung down from her horse, already untying her bag. "How bad are we talking about?" "4 broken ribs, 3 broken fingers, and her left eye is swollen completely shut. Ruth did everything she could, but you need to see her. Take me to her room." Caleb led her toward the house. He stopped her right at the bedroom door. "Hannah, before you head in there, you need to know something. It can wait." "No, it cannot." He lowered his voice. "Her name is Maggie Colton. She told me she mailed a package to you, some kind of documents, right before she left Missouri." Hannah's hand froze right on the doorknob. All the color drained from her face so fast Caleb thought she might just fall over. "That package," she whispered, "that package was from her." "Yes, ma'am. I figured it was just a mistake. Some mail that got sent to the wrong place. I have not even opened it yet." "Well, you are going to want to, but first you need to patch her up." Hannah looked at him for a long moment, then she pushed open the door. Maggie was propped up in the bed with a stack of pillows Ruth had put behind her. In the bright light of day, the injuries looked a whole lot worse than they had by the lamp. Her face was a terrible map of purple and yellow bruises. Her broken fingers had been splinted with little pieces of wood and cloth from Ruth's mending basket. Maggie. Hannah put her bag on the floor and pulled a chair up close. "I am Dr. Price. I am going to take a look at you now. Can you tell me where it hurts the worst?" "Everywhere." Maggie's voice was empty of all feeling. "But mostly my ribs on the left side." Hannah's hands were quick and gentle. She worked without a word for a few minutes, carefully pressing and checking how Maggie responded. Maggie just laid there with her jaw clenched tight. She only gasped out once when Hannah checked to see how much she could move her broken fingers. "Ruth did a fine job," Hannah said when she was done. "The ribs are cracked, but they are not broken clean through. That is a lucky thing. Your fingers need to be set again. 2 of them have already started to heal crooked, which tells me they were broken before this last beating." "6 weeks ago," Maggie said in a quiet voice. Hannah stopped what she was doing. "Was it your husband?" It was not a question. Maggie's eyes snapped toward her. "How did you know?" "Because I have treated women just like you before, and their injuries always tell the exact same story." Hannah opened her bag and started laying out her tools with a steady hand. "I am going to reset those fingers for you now. It is going to hurt something awful. Do you want something to help with the pain?" "No. I want to feel it. That is not being brave. That is you trying to punish yourself." "Maybe so, but I have to keep my head clear. I cannot afford to be all fuzzy right now." Hannah watched her for a second, and then she gave a slow nod. "Bite down hard on this." She gave Maggie a strap of folded leather. "You go on and scream if you feel the need. There is no shame in it." The sound that came out from behind that closed door made Caleb's hands ball up into fists on the porch railing. Ruth came and stood next to him and put a hand on his arm. "She is a tough one," Ruth said. "She should not have to be." "No, she should not. But she is. And at this moment, that is the only thing that is keeping her alive." A second cry, this one sharper than the first, was followed by silence. Then they could hear Hannah's muffled voice, speaking calm and steady. About 10 minutes later, Hannah came out, wiping her hands on a clean cloth. "The fingers are set the right way now. I wrapped her ribs up a bit tighter." The eye, she paused. "I believe she will keep her sight, but there might be some lasting damage. She is going to need at least 2 weeks of complete rest before she is in any shape to travel." "She does not have 2 weeks," Caleb said. "Then she is going to have to find the time. Because if one of those ribs moves the wrong way, it could puncture a lung. And if that happens, it will not matter one bit who is chasing her." Ruth stepped up. "I will stay here. I will watch over her." "There is something else," Hannah said. She looked around to make sure they were by themselves. "That package she was talking about. I have it back at my office in Helena. I almost threw it out. It did not have a return address, just my name. It did not feel right, so I held on to it." "Can you get your hands on it?" Caleb asked. "I can send someone for it. My assistant can ride and get it, but that is a 2-day trip, round trip. That is 2 days Maggie does not have if her husband's men are already out there looking for her." "They are." The voice came from down the hall. Maggie was standing there again, holding onto the door frame to stay upright. Her face was pale with the pain it took just to walk. "Virgil Kane does not give up. If they left me breathing, even if it was an accident, Douglas will send Virgil right back to finish the job. You need to get back in that bed," Hannah said, her tone firm. "I need to be a part of this talk. It is my life y'all are making decisions about." Caleb looked at her, so pale and swaying, held up by nothing more than pure grit and anger. He grabbed a chair from the kitchen table. "Sit down. Talk. Then you're going back to bed." Maggie let herself be lowered into the chair, and she accepted Ruth's steadying hand without a fight. That little thing, letting Ruth help her, was not lost on Caleb. She was starting to learn she could accept help from the women. The men, well, that was going to take a bit longer. "Tell us about this Virgil Kane," Caleb said. "He used to be in the army." "Got discharged for," Maggie swallowed hard, "for being too rough with prisoners. Douglas hired him 3 years ago to be a security man. He is in charge of the whiskey shipments. He is in charge of anyone who starts asking too many questions. He was in charge of me. He is the one who beat you. He is the one who seemed to like it." Maggie's good eye was as hard as a rock. "The other fella, I do not know his name, he tried to get him to stop. He said Douglas did not want me dead. Virgil told him that Douglas did not get to make that call anymore. So Virgil is working on his own now, Caleb said. Not exactly. Douglas wants me to be quiet. Virgil wants me to be dead. There is a difference between the two, but the result for me is the same if he finds me. Ruth poured some coffee and pushed a cup into Maggie's good hand. How would they be able to track you all the way out here? You were left out on an empty trail. Virgil will backtrack. He will ride that whole trail, find the spot where I was, and he will see that I am not there anymore. Then he will start asking questions in every little town for 50 miles around. A woman who has been beaten up, showing up out of nowhere. That is not the kind of thing folks tend to forget. The kitchen got real quiet. She was right. Caleb had carried a woman who was half dead through his own front door in the middle of the day. Tom had seen it. Ruth had seen it. It was not exactly a well-kept secret. Elk Bend is a small town, Ruth said slowly. News gets around fast. Has anybody from town seen her? Hannah asked. No, she has not set foot off this ranch. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. But Tom came tearing through town to fetch you, Hannah. If a soul had asked what his hurry was, he wouldn't have said a word. Ruth's tone was certain. That boy is 22, and his idea of a secret is a stage whisper. Caleb was pacing a rut in the floorboards. All right, this is the plan. Hannah, you send for that paperwork, and use the fastest rider you've got. Ruth, you'll stay put with Maggie. I'm riding into Elkbend to listen to the town talk and see if strangers have been asking around. And if they have been, Maggie questioned, then we handle it. That's not a plan, Caleb. That's just hoping for the best. Sometimes that's the only hand you're dealt. Maggie studied him with that sharp, knowing look she'd had since that first night. You were a lawman before you started ranching. Caleb froze. Who told you that? Nobody had to. It is the way you walk the floor when you are thinking. The way you stand between me and the door without even knowing you are doing it. The way you size up a threat. She cocked her head. You have done this kind of work before. Deputy Sheriff back in Kansas. A long time ago. Why did you leave the badge behind? I told you that is a story for another time. It is another time. Ruth and Hannah shared a quick look. Ruth cleared her voice. I need to go check on a little something. Hannah, come help me with it. What kind of something? Ruth took Hannah by the arm, guiding her out. The kind of something that is in the barn, and needs the both of us right this minute. Once they had left, Caleb took a seat across the table from Maggie. The kitchen fell silent, save for the steady tick of the clock on the mantel and the faint sounds of Tom working out in the yard. There was a family, he began. The Dawsons. They were homesteaders just outside of Dodge City. A big cattle outfit that wanted their land had been making threats against them. It was the usual ugly business, fences cut and livestock run off. They even fired a few shots in the dark of night. He paused and Maggie just waited. They came to me asking for my help. I promised them I would ride out first thing in the morning to see about it. His voice got quiet. I should have left right then, but I was worn out and figured one more night would not make a difference. I did not think the cattle company would do anything too serious. Caleb, I got out there at sunrise and I found the house burned to the ground. Thomas Dawson was shot dead in the yard. His wife, Sarah, was in the doorway of the kitchen. Their little boy. He stopped talking again, and the silence stretched on longer this time. Their son, Billy, was only 7 years old. He had managed to hide down in the root cellar. The boy was alive, but he had heard every last thing. That was not on you, Caleb. If you had been there, you might have been killed too. Then who would have saved the boy? He met her gaze, his expression full of something raw. That is what everybody told me. It never helped. I understand. After Douglas hit me the first time, everyone told me I ought to just leave him. That is easy advice to give out. It is a lot harder to follow when you are the one living in the middle of the storm. She laid her good hand on the table, not quite touching his own. Just near it. You found Maggie Colton lying in the dirt, and you did something. You did not just ride on by. You did not decide to wait for morning. It was not the same situation. It was the exact same. And this time, you were there to help. He glanced at her hand. just inches away from his. He made no move to take it. But he did not pull his back either. "I am going to see to it that you are safe, Maggie. I need you to understand that. I believe that you will try. That is not the same as believing in me. No, it is not. But it is the most trust I have had in anyone in 3 long years. Take it." A smile almost touched his lips. Almost. Fair enough. The quiet moment was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats from outside. They were coming fast. Caleb shot to his feet in a single motion, his hand reaching for the revolver on a kitchen shelf. He moved over to the window. Tom was sprinting from the barn and a rider was pushing his horse up the road at a dead run. It was not anyone Caleb knew. "Get to the bedroom," he said to Maggie. "Who is that?" "I do not know. Go on now." For the first time, she did what she was told without a word. She disappeared down the hall, and he heard the bedroom door click shut. Ruth came out from the barn with Hannah right beside her, both of them staring at the man riding toward them. The rider reined his horse in at the gate. He was young, covered in dust, and sitting on a horse that looked about to collapse. He had a deputy's star pinned to his chest. "I am looking for Caleb Mercer," the man shouted. "You have found him," Caleb answered, stepping out onto the porch. His hand rested near his holster, looking casual. "What can I do for you, deputy?" "Name is Willis, from Sheriff Yates's office over in Elk Bend. The sheriff sent me." The deputy swung down from his horse, taking a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "A man came through town this morning. He was well dressed and had 2 other men with him asking about a woman. He claimed she was his wife, that she had gone missing, and he was deeply concerned for her well-being." A chill went through Caleb, but he kept his expression perfectly calm. "Is that a fact?" He described her as a woman with dark hair, in her late 20s, possibly hurt. Said she was confused and had a tendency toward hysterics. The deputy looked a little uncomfortable. "The sheriff thought you should be told since you own the only ranch on the North Trail. And because you were in town just a few days ago buying up extra supplies, medical things." Ruth stepped up. "I have been feeling under the weather. Those supplies you mentioned were for me." The deputy turned his gaze on her. Ruth Calloway met his look with the kind of force a woman gets after 30 years of staring down rowdy men in her saloon. The deputy was the first to look away. "Yes, ma'am, I am sure that is right." "What did Sheriff Yates tell this fella?" Caleb asked. He told him he had not heard a thing. He pointed him down the South Road. "The South Road does not lead anywhere for 60 miles. I reckon the sheriff is aware of that." The deputy tucked the paper back inside his pocket. "The sheriff also wanted me to tell you, and this is exactly what he said. If a man has something he needs to protect, this would be the right time to get his affairs in order." Caleb gave a slow nod. "Tell Emmett I am grateful for the heads up." He said one last thing. The well-dressed man said his name was Douglas Colulton, a merchant from Missouri. The deputy climbed back on his horse. The fellow riding with him, a big man with a scar down his neck, he did not give his name at all. He just sat there on his horse, smiling at folks. "Virgil Kane. Thank you for your time, deputy. You watch your back, Mr. Mercer." Willis gave a tip of his hat and rode away. The 4 of them, Caleb, Ruth, Hannah, and Tom, just stood there in the yard. No one said anything for a good long while. Then Ruth finally said what was on all their minds. "He is in Elk Bend right now." Caleb looked straight at Tom. "How long ago did you ride through town?" "It was early this morning before the sun was even up. Did anybody lay eyes on you?" Tom's face just fell. "I made a stop at the general store. Miller was just opening the place up. He had to swallow hard. "I told him I was going to fetch the doctor for a woman Caleb had found injured out on the trail." Ruth just shut her eyes. "Oh, Tom, I know," Caleb began. "I know. I'm so sorry, boss. I just was not thinking." "That man Miller talks to every person in the county," Ruth said, her voice flat. "If Douglas Colulton starts asking around, he will hear about an injured woman at Pine Ridge Ranch before the sun goes down. Then we have until sundown." Caleb's voice changed. It was not any louder or any quicker, but a hard edge had crept into it. The rancher was gone, and the deputy sheriff had taken his place. "Hannah, What is the fastest your assistant can get here with that paperwork? 2 days if he pushes it. That is too long. Can you go back and get it yourself? I only just arrived. Your patient needs to still be breathing in 2 days. At this moment, that evidence is the only thing that will stop a bullet from finding Maggie. Hannah pressed her lips into a thin line, thinking it over. If I leave this minute and I ride all through the night, I can make it back here by tomorrow evening. Then do it, Caleb said. She needs medical care. With those ribs, Ruth and I can handle it. We do not have another option. Hannah glanced toward the house, then looked back at Caleb. If I go and do this and something bad happens to her while I'm away, nothing is going to happen to her. Hannah met his stare for a long, silent moment, and she must have seen something in his face that convinced her. She gave a single sharp nod, turned around, and started to resaddle her horse. Ruth put a hand on Caleb's arm. I will go and let Maggie know. No, I will do it. He found her perched on the side of the bed, her hands gripping the edges of the mattress so hard her knuckles were white. Her whole body was rigid with tension. She had heard the horses, the voices, and she had been in this room picturing the worst. Is it Douglas? Not yet, but he is in Elkbend. He and Virgil Kane are asking questions about you. All the color drained from her face. She held onto the mattress even tighter. Sheriff Yates sent them off in the wrong direction. That bought us a little time, but there is always a chance they will double back. Maggie, I need you to look at me. She finally lifted her eyes to meet his. Hannah is riding back to get your papers. She should be back by tomorrow evening. Between this moment and that one, I am asking you to trust me. Can you do that? I do not know how to do that anymore. Yes, you do. You put your trust in Ruth when she taped up your ribs. You just trusted Hannah with your broken fingers. You told me the truth about everything last night when you could have easily lied. That is not the same. How is it different? Because trusting a woman to help me is hard enough. Trusting a man to keep me safe, her voice broke. The last man who made me a promise to protect me is the very same one who sent Virgil Kane to find me. Her words hit the air between them like heavy stones. Caleb felt every bit of their weight and did not try to brush them aside. I know, and I know there is not a single thing I can say that will change that. Words from men come cheap. So I am not going to ask you to believe mine. He knelt down in front of her, so they were at the same eye level. I am going to ask you to just watch me. Watch what I do, and then you can make up your own mind. She looked deep into his face the way she always did, searching for any sign of a lie, any hidden darkness. He let her search. He had. There is nothing to hide. All right, she said, her voice low. I will keep an eye out. Good. Now, we need to start thinking about moving you. Moving me where? Ruth's house in town is out in the open, but there is an old line cabin about 2 miles north of here, tucked up in the hills. It used to be for shepherds. Nobody ever goes up that way in the summertime. It is small, but it is well hidden. You want me to run away? I want you to be somewhere that Kane cannot find you if he shows up at this ranch. And what do you think happens to you if he shows up at this ranch and I'm gone? He will know you hid me. He will make you tell him where I am. He can try. Caleb, you need to stop talking like you are made of steel. You are not. I have seen what Virgil does to men who stand in his way, and I have seen what he does to women. His voice was quiet, but it was as solid as iron. I am not going to let that happen again. Their eyes met and held. Something passed between them that neither one of them had a name for. It was more than being thankful, more than just an attraction. It was deeper than something that should grow in just 2 weeks. But trouble has its own way of measuring time. Sometimes you can learn more about a person in 5 days of a crisis than you can in 5 years of a normal life. I am not going to that line cabin, Maggie said, her voice firm. Maggie, for one thing. I spent 3 long years running from Douglas, hiding, trying to make myself disappear. And it all ended with me lying face down in the dirt, just waiting to die. She stood up, wincing from the pain, but standing steady. If Virgil Kane comes looking for me at this ranch, I want to be right here. I want to look him in the eye. I want that man to look at me and see I am not broken. You have 4 cracked ribs and 3 busted fingers, but your spine is still holding up just fine. Ruth's voice drifted in from the kitchen. She has a good point, Caleb. Have you been listening this whole time? I am 58 years old. I run a restaurant and I raised 4 children all on my own. I have been listening to other people's conversations since long before you were born. Through all the pain, Maggie actually laughed. It was a small sound, and it hurt. She clutched her side right away, but the laugh was real. It was the first honest-to-goodness laugh Caleb had heard from her. It changed her whole face. "All right," Caleb said as he stood up. "You can stay, but we're going to do this my way. Tom, take the horses out to the back pasture. If anyone rides up, it will look like nobody is home. Ruth, can you get a message to the sheriff? But do it quietly. My nephew takes eggs to the jail every Tuesday. That is today. You tell Yates that Douglas Kalulton's wife is right here. Tell him she is alive and she has proof of federal crimes. If Yates is half the lawman he says he is, he will know just what to do." "And what if he is not?" Maggie asked. "Then we are about to find out what kind of man Emmett Yates truly is." Ruth was gone within 10 minutes, carrying her basket of eggs and biscuits, looking for all the world like she was just making a routine delivery. Tom had already moved the horses. Hannah was just a speck of dust on the road heading north. That left Caleb and Maggie all alone in the house with 1 rifle, 1 revolver, and whatever was coming for them. Caleb went through the house, checking every window and every door. He loaded the rifle and placed it near the front entrance. Then he checked the chambers of the revolver. "Do you know how to use one of these?" he asked. Maggie nodded. "Douglas taught me, back before everything went wrong. He said a woman on the frontier ought to know how to handle a firearm. It is funny how that ended up working out for him. I was thinking the very same thing." She held out her good hand. "Give me the revolver. The broken fingers are on my right hand. I shoot with my left." He studied her for a moment. She looked right back, as steady as a rock. He passed the gun to her. She checked the cylinder, felt its weight, and sighted down the barrel. Her grip was sure, and her stance was natural. Douglas Kalulton had taught his wife very well, and now that skill was hers alone. "6 rounds," she said. 6 rounds. She placed the revolver on the table next to her where she could reach it easily. "Then let us just hope I only need to use 1. The afternoon dragged on, long and hot. The July heat seemed to press in on the small house. Caleb sat by the front window, watching. Maggie sat at the kitchen table. They did not say much. There was not a whole lot left to say. All the words had been spoken. Now it was just about waiting and watching and being ready. Around 4 o'clock, dust kicked up on the south road. "A rider is coming," Caleb said. Maggie's hand went straight to the revolver. "Just 1 man. Virgil is not the kind of man who travels by himself." "I know." They both watched as the cloud of dust got bigger. Caleb raised his rifle. With her thumb, Maggie pulled back the hammer on her revolver. The click sounded mighty loud in that silent house. The rider finally came into view. It was Sheriff Emmett Yates, all alone, riding at a slow pace. The afternoon sun glinted off the badge on his chest. Caleb did not lower his rifle. He could be leading them right to us. He could be. Maggie did not lower her revolver either. Yates reined in his horse at the gate. He raised both of his hands with his palms facing out. "Mercer, I am by myself. Ruth sent me. Now, can we talk this out like civilized folk? Or are you planning on shooting me right off my horse? That depends on what you came here to say. I came to tell you that Douglas Kalulton and 2 of his men are down at the hotel in Elk Bend as we speak, asking everyone in town about a woman with dark hair. And I also came to say—" He paused for a moment. "I came to say that I'm tired of being scared of the wrong kind of people." Caleb glanced over at Maggie. She met his gaze. Without a word, a decision was made between them. He lowered the rifle. She let the hammer down on the revolver. "Come on inside, Sheriff," Caleb called out. "We have a whole lot to tell you, and not very much time to say it." Sheriff Emmett Yates sat down at Caleb's kitchen table, holding his hat in his hands. He had the look of a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. Maggie sat on the other side of the table, the revolver still close by. Caleb stood by the window, keeping his eyes on the road. "Start talking, Emmett," Caleb said, not even turning around. Douglas Colulton rode into Elkbend this morning, and he had 2 men with him. One of them, a big fellow with a scar on his neck, went into Miller's store first. He asked all casual-like if any strangers had been passing through. Miller did not say much, but his wife sure did. Yates rubbed his tired face. She told them about a young ranch hand who had come through before the sun was up, riding hard. Said he mentioned something about a woman he had heard up on the North Trail. Maggie's hand gripped the edge of the table tighter. "Colulton came to my office next, polite as a preacher on Sunday. He showed me one of those old photographs. Said his wife had gone missing. Said she was delicate and prone to imagining things." Yates looked straight at Maggie. "Is that you? That is his story about me. What is the real story?" "The real story is the one with 4 cracked ribs and 3 broken fingers, which his man Virgil Kane gave me right before he left me to bleed out on a dirt trail." Yates was quiet for a second. I had a feeling it was something like that. A man shows up with 2 armed riders looking for his fragile wife. That is not worry you are seeing. That is a hunting party. "So why did you send them south?" Caleb asked. "Because something about the whole situation did not feel right. And also because Ruth Calloway marched into my office 2 hours later with a basket full of eggs and a look that could sour milk, and she told me exactly what was going on." He turned his attention back to Maggie. "Mrs. Colulton, Ruth said you have some kind of evidence about federal crimes. It was whiskey running to the reservations. I did have proof. My husband's men took the original papers when they caught me, but I had already mailed copies to a Dr. Hannah Price right here in the territory. She is riding to get them as we speak." "When?" "Tomorrow evening, maybe even sooner if she rides hard." Yates let out a long, slow breath. "That is going to be a problem, because I sent Colulton down the south road, but that road comes to a dead end at Keller's Creek. He will figure that out by nightfall, and then he will double back. By morning he will be asking tougher questions, and I will not be able to send him on a wild goose chase a second time without showing my hand." "Then we have tonight," Caleb said flatly. "Tonight, and whatever bit of luck the good Lord decides to give us." Yates sat up straighter in his chair. "I'm going to be straight with the both of you. I have not been a brave man. I took this badge because the pay was reliable and Elkbend was a quiet town. I have looked the other way on things I should not have because looking them straight in the eye would have brought me nothing but trouble." "Why are you telling us this now?" Maggie asked. "Because I need you to understand what it is costing me to be sitting in this very room." He met her gaze. "And because Ruth told me something that I cannot forget." She said, "Emmett Yates, you can die a coward, or you can live like a man, but you cannot do both. That woman has been telling me hard truths for 20 years, and I have just been too stubborn to listen." "Are you listening now?" Caleb asked. "I am here, am I not?" Caleb finally turned away from the window. "All right. What can you actually—" "Officially, there is not much I can do. As far as the law is concerned, Colton has not broken any rules here I can prove. He is just a worried man searching for his wife who disappeared. His boys have not made any threats. I cannot just lock a man up for having good manners. Now, unofficially, I have got 4 deputies under me. 2 are solid fellas. The other 2 would trade their own mothers for a decent meal, so they will not be hearing about any of this." He took a creased paper out of his coat. "This came in, too. It arrived on the wire this afternoon from the United States Marshal's office up in Helena. Looks like someone—" He looked over at Maggie. "Sent in a complaint about illegal whiskey being sold on tribal land 3 weeks back before you even packed up from Missouri." Maggie looked surprised. I did that. I sent a letter to the marshal's office. I never got a reply. I figured they just tossed it aside. Well, they did not toss it. They have been putting a case together on the quiet. This wire says a federal man, name of Samuel Harding, is on the case and headed to Montana territory. Yates placed the paper down on the table. The trouble is, headed this way could be next week or it could be next month. The government only moves when it wants to. We do not have until next week, Caleb stated. No, you surely do not. And that is why I am about to suggest what might just be the most foolish plan I have ever cooked up. Yates got to his feet. I am heading back to town. In the morning when Colton shows up again and starts asking questions, I am going to say I got word his wife was spotted going east, in the direction of Fort Benton. That ought to buy you a day, maybe two. And when he learns I misled him, well, I suppose I will see if this badge is worth the metal it is made of. Yates settled his hat on his head. One last thing. That big fella with the scar, Kane. He did not check into the hotel with Colton. He went his own way. Has not been seen since midday. A chill settled over the kitchen. He is scouting, Caleb said. That is what I would bet. A man cut from that cloth does not just sit around a hotel waiting. He goes out to find his own answers. Yates walked toward the door. Bolt everything tonight, Mercer, and do not put your faith in that front gate. If Kane is worth a damn, he is not coming by the main road. Once Yates was gone, the quiet in the house felt heavy, like a thick blanket. Maggie was sitting perfectly still, the pistol now resting in her lap, her thumb tracing the handle. He is out there, she whispered. Virgil, moving around in the dark right now, not quite yet. There is still daylight. He will bide his time. You do not know him like I do. I know the kind of man he is. I have tracked men like that, and I have had them track me. He is a patient one. He will want to make certain before he makes his play. And once he is certain, he will make it, and I will be waiting. We, Maggie said, correcting him, will be waiting. Caleb studied her, this woman holding a revolver with broken fingers, her ribs bound up tight, one eye swollen nearly closed. She looked like she had been through a war, but was held together by nothing but pure grit. We, he said in agreement. They got the house ready. Caleb slid the heavy bar across the back door and made sure every window was latched tight. He set the rifle near the front entrance and put a shotgun from his bedroom down the back hall. Tom was back from taking the horses to pasture, and Caleb told him to head into town to Ruth's place. I am not going, boss. Yes, you are. If things go bad here tonight, somebody has to be around to know it. Ruth has to know. And if Hannah shows up from the south, we need someone to get her here quick. But, Tom, Caleb put a firm hand on the young man's shoulder. This is not about being scared. This is about being smart. I need you where you can do the most good. And that place is in town. Tom clenched his jaw. He glanced at Maggie, then his eyes went back to Caleb. You make sure she stays safe. That is the plan. Tom galloped off just as the sun began to sink. Caleb saw him disappear down the road before shutting and bolting the main door. It is just the two of us now, Maggie called from the kitchen. Just us. The night dragged on. Caleb put on a pot of coffee. Maggie tried to get down one of Ruth's leftover biscuits, but her stomach turned after just half of it. Pain and worry do not make for a good appetite. Tell me about what happened in Kansas, she said. Look, if we have got a man coming to end us tonight, I would just as soon not sit here waiting in the quiet. He filled 2 mugs with coffee and took a seat opposite her. I already told you about the Dawsons. You told me how they were killed. You never told me what came next. After. He held his warm mug with both hands. After that, I brought in 3 men who worked for the cattle company. I had people who saw what happened, had the proof. It was as clear a case as you could get. Turns out it was not. That cattle company had deep pockets by good lawyers. Those lawyers got 2 of the men to walk free. The last one, the fellow who actually did the shooting, he got 5 years but was out in 18 months. He took a long swallow of his coffee. I went to see the judge, told him it was not right. He told me that justice is whatever the court says it is, and I had better get used to it. So you left the law. I placed my badge right on his desk and left that town. Got myself a horse and pointed it west. I did not look back until I reached Montana. He put his mug down. That all happened 3 years ago. I have not pinned on a badge since. Have not aimed a gun at another man since. I promised myself I was through with that life. But you are not through with it. I suppose not. He met her gaze from across the table. You want the honest truth? The moment I saw you on that trail, my first instinct was not to help you. My first instinct was to keep on riding. The thought was as clear as day in my head. Just keep going. This is not your problem. What made you change your mind? You did. You were there in the dust, with your hands all busted up and your face swollen, and you still tried to drag yourself away from me. You tried to defend yourself when you had absolutely nothing left. And it made me think. He trailed off. I thought about young Billy Dawson hiding down in that cellar while his folks were being killed. I thought about how different it might have been if just one person had been there. Just one person who decided not to just ride on by. Maggie's hand stretched across the table. This time it did not hesitate. Her uninjured hand found his and squeezed tight. You were there, she said softly. For me. You were the one who was there. His hand wrapped around hers, his rough skin against her smooth, his warmth against her cold. They sat like that without a word for a good while, and in that quiet, a change happened between them. It was not some big, sudden thing, but it was real, like a fence post being pulled from the ground, 1 inch at a time. An unexpected noise from outside broke the spell. Caleb shot to his feet in a heartbeat, his hand finding the rifle. Maggie snatched up her pistol. What was that? She breathed. He moved toward the window, keeping his back to the wall, trying to see into the growing darkness. It could just be a critter, or it could be Virgil. Then another noise. The distinct sound of metal hitting metal. The latch on the barn. You stay put, Caleb ordered. No. Maggie, for once, just... I said, no. If he is out there, we either face him as a team, or we do not face him at all. He wanted to fight her on it. Every bit of his training as a deputy yelled at him to protect the civilian while he dealt with the danger. But Maggie Colton was not just some civilian. She was the reason for the danger, and she had made up her mind to fight back. He had no right to deny her that. Get behind me, he finally said. And if they get me, you keep firing until that gun is out of bullets. You are not going down, just to be safe. He lifted the bar from the front door carefully, pulling it open just a crack. The yard was washed in the gray of dusk, where every shape started to blur. The barn was 60 feet out, and its big door was open just a little. He knew he had shut that door. He was positive. Watch my back from the porch, he whispered. Do not shoot unless you are sure of what you are aiming at. Maggie gave a short nod, leaning hard against a porch support. The revolver was firm in her left hand, even as her splinted right one throbbed with a dull ache. Caleb made his way across the open ground, bent low, his rifle at the ready, every nerve on high alert. About 20 feet from the barn, he heard a sound, a heavy, strained breathing. It was not the sound of a man lying in wait. It was the sound of a man in pain. He threw the barn door open with a kick, the rifle aimed straight ahead. A man was sprawled on the straw-covered floor, holding his gut. Dark blood was pushing through his fingers, looking black in the dim light. His eyes, wide with fear and hurt, locked onto Caleb. Please, the man choked out. He shot me. He just shot me and rode off. Caleb did not know the man's face. He was young, maybe in his mid-20s, dressed in dusty trail clothes with no gun in sight. Who are you? Caleb asked sharply, keeping the rifle steady. Name is Garrett. Will Garrett. I am one of... He coughed, and blood dotted his lips. I was one of Colton's men. I was there with Kane when he did that to your woman. Caleb's finger grew tight on the trigger. Please. I told him to stop on the trail. I told Kane that Colton wanted her alive. He would not listen. And when I went to get him off her, he... Garrett let out a pained sound. He remembered that part. Caleb. Maggie's voice was right behind him. She had followed him out. He should have known she would. She was framed in the barn's entrance, her revolver pointed right at the dying man. Then he saw her face harden. "That is him," she said. "He is the other one, the one who was with him." "I know," Garrett cried, tears tracing clean lines through the dirt on his cheeks. "I know I was there, and I am so sorry. May God have mercy on me. I am sorry. I should have done something else. I should have made him stop." "You should have," Maggie replied, her voice as flat and cold as a river stone. "But you did not. Kane put a bullet in me about 2 hours ago, maybe a mile down the road." He pushed down on his bleeding stomach. "He called me a weak link, said I was getting soft. He left me to make my way here and die just like he left you." "Why did you come here?" Caleb questioned. "How did you even find this place?" "Because Kane found it. He has been out there watching this place since yesterday. He knows she is in there. He even knows the sheriff came by." Garrett's words were getting weaker. "He is just waiting for it to get completely dark. He is planning on coming from the north, using the trees for cover. Colton has no idea Kane is doing this by himself. His plan is to kill her, and then just tell Colton he found her that way." Maggie brought her pistol down, but not because she felt sorry for him. It was a calculated move. "And why in the world should we trust a single word you say?" "Because I am model, dying ma'am. And lying to a woman I helped hurt is not how I want to face my maker." Caleb knelt down next to him and looked at the wound. He was gut shot, and it was bad. Without Hannah, this man would not see the morning. He might not even last that long. "How many guns does Kane carry?" Caleb asked. "2 revolvers and a knife, and he is better with the knife than anything else." "Is he by himself?" "Yes. The other man, Peters, he is with Colton back in town. Kane likes to work alone when he is killing. He always says that witnesses are just complications." Caleb stood up and turned to Maggie. Her face was as hard as stone. This man had watched while she was beaten and had done too little, too late. And now here he was, bleeding in their barn, begging for the same mercy he had not offered her. "What do you want to do?" Caleb asked her. "Not just about Garrett. About all of it. I want to stop running." She looked down at the dying man on the floor. Then she looked at Caleb, and then out toward the darkening sky where, somewhere in those trees, Virgil Kane was loading his guns. "Patch him up just enough to keep him alive. We are going to need his testimony. And Kane. Kane is coming for us, whether we are ready for him or not." She checked the revolver's chambers one more time. All 6 were loaded. "So, let us be ready." Caleb took off his belt and pushed it into Garrett's hands. "Keep pressure on that wound. Do not die before morning comes. We need you to be able to talk to a federal investigator." "I will try, sir." "Do not try. Do it." They went back to the house. Caleb barred the door again and gathered every lamp from every room, putting them all in the kitchen. Then he blew them all out, one by one. "What are you doing?" Maggie asked. "Light just makes us into targets. The dark lets us disappear." He took a position at the window that faced north, the direction Garrett said Kane would come from. "Sit down below the window on the east wall. Do not let yourself make a silhouette." She slid down the wall until she was sitting, the revolver in her lap. Her back was straight despite the fire she felt in her ribs. "Caleb." "Yeah. If he manages to get through you and he gets to me, I am using the last bullet on myself. I just need you to know that. He is not going to get through me. But if he does, he is not. Caleb, I need to say this out loud. I will not let Virgil Kane touch me ever again. That is not up for negotiation." He was quiet for a beat. "Then I had better not let him through. That is what I am counting on." The darkness became complete. There was no moon, just a blanket of stars that gave off just enough light to make out shapes but not enough to see faces. Caleb controlled his breathing just like he had learned back in Kansas, long and slow. It kept his heart rate down and kept his hands steady on the rifle. An hour went by, and then another. Maggie did not move, she did not speak, and she did not sleep. He could hear her breathing, just as controlled and deliberate as his own. She was doing the exact same thing he was. She was waiting and managing her fear, and locked it in. Just shy of midnight, Caleb sensed it. It was not a noise, but the lack of one. All the crickets out by the northern trees had gone completely still. Something was prowling through the brush, something big enough to make all the little critters hold their breath. He is here, Caleb thought to himself. Maggie's thumb slid over to the revolver's hammer. A dark shape pulled away from the tree line. It was moving low and smooth, making for the barn. Cain had no idea Garrett was in there. Or maybe he did. Maybe he was coming to admire his own dirty work. The barn door let out a long groan, followed by a heavy silence. Then a voice cut through the night air, cold and filled with a sort of cruel amusement. "Well now, Garrett, you got a whole lot farther than I figured you would." Garrett's reply was just a whisper on the wind. But Cain's next words came through loud and clear. "She is in the house, is she not? Good. I was hoping things would get personal." The barn door slammed open. Cain stepped out into the yard. Caleb could see him plain as day now, a tall, wide man who moved with the casual certainty of a seasoned predator. He was walking a straight line right to the house. Caleb lifted the rifle, settling the sight square on Virgil Cain's chest. "That is far enough, Cain." Cain halted. He was not startled, not in the least. He just cocked his head like a curious hound. "The cowboy," he said. "Mercer, is that right? I do not believe we have been properly acquainted." "We do not need an acquaintance. I need you to show me your hands. And if I do not, you will shoot me from the safety of a dark window?" That is not very sportsmanlike. I am not feeling very sportsmanlike. Cain actually let out a chuckle, a real honest-to-goodness chuckle. "You know what I reckon, Mercer? I reckon you are a man who has been away from this life for too long. I bet your hands are trembling on that rifle this very second. I bet you have not put a man down in years, and you are not sure you still have it in you." Caleb's hands were steady as a rock. "You can test that theory. Perhaps I will." Cain took one more step. "But first, Maggie, I know you are in there, sweetheart. Douglas sends his best. He says he misses you. He says he will forgive every last thing if you just come on home." Maggie's voice shot out from the house, sharp and steady, without a hint of fear. "You tell Douglas he can go straight to hell, and you can lead the parade." Cain roared with laughter, a deep, genuine sound, as if Maggie had just told the best joke he had heard in his entire life. "There she is. That is the Maggie who scratched up my face and kicked out the floorboard of the wagon. I told Douglas you had more grit than he gave you credit for." "This is your last warning, Cain," Caleb said. "Hands in the air, or I will put you in the ground. You will not shoot, not right away. You want to know why?" Cain's voice was calm, almost neighborly. "Because deep down you are a lawman, Mercer. A former deputy from Kansas. Oh, yes, I looked into you. You are a man who believes in rules and doing things by the book. You want me in cuffs, not in a pine box. And that little bit of hesitation is going to be your downfall." Cain did not move toward the house, but to the side. And he moved fast, faster than a man his size had any right to in the dead of night. He dove behind the water trough just as Caleb's shot cracked the air, a half-second too late, sending splinters flying from the wood. "You missed," Cain shouted. "See? I told you so." Caleb worked the bolt, sliding another round into the chamber. "I have got all night and a box full of bullets. No, you do not. Because in about 3 seconds you are going to have a hard choice to make." A match sputtered to life in the dark. Cain held it up from his hiding spot, and in its flickering light, Caleb saw what was in his other hand. It was a bottle with a rag stuffed in the top. Kerosene. The sharp, oily smell reached him a moment later. "That barn of yours is filled with dry hay, Mercer, and that boy I shot in the gut is not in any shape to crawl out." Cain touched the match to the rag. It erupted in flames that licked up the cloth. So, what will it be? Take a shot at me and watch the barn go up with a man inside, or go save the boy and let me come for your woman. Caleb, do not do it, Maggie yelled from the house. But Cain was already throwing. The bottle sailed through the air, a fiery comet that shattered against the barn door. Flames exploded outward, racing up the dry wood. The dry wood caught fire, the hay inside leaping toward the flames like a hungry animal. A man's scream tore through the barn. Garrett Caleb's legs were moving before his head caught up. He launched off the porch, leaving his rifle behind, because a man was burning alive just 60 feet from him. And every fiber of his being, every mistake he made back in Kansas, every promise to himself that he would never be too late again, pushed him on. "Caleb, no!" Maggie yelled out. He slammed his shoulder into the barn door. A wall of heat hit him. Smoke choked his lungs. Garrett was on the floor trying to pull himself toward the entrance. His wound left a dark streak in the straw. Caleb hooked his arms under Garrett and dragged him out of there. The two of them tumbled into the yard just as the fire exploded behind them. And in that moment, Cain made his play. From the window, Maggie saw it all. Cain rose up from behind the water trough, not running toward the house, but moseying along like he was on his way to Sunday supper. He had both revolvers out, pointed straight at Caleb's defenseless back as he pulled Garrett away from the inferno. She didn't hesitate. She didn't take careful aim. She just walked out onto the porch, brought up the revolver in her left hand, and fired. The bullet tore into Cain's left shoulder. He spun and stumbled but stayed on his feet. He looked over at her, surprise finally cracking that cool exterior of his. "Well now," he said through clenched teeth. "Douglas sure did underestimate you." She fired a second time. She missed. The kickback shot a bolt of pain through her broken ribs, and her vision swam. Cain lifted his right revolver, taking a bead on her. Caleb blindsided him with a tackle. They crashed to the ground, and both guns went flying. Cain was the bigger man, had more weight on him, but Caleb had speed and pure rage. They rolled in the dirt, all fists and elbows. Cain slammed a knee into Caleb's side, and Caleb heard something pop. He paid him back with an elbow to Cain's injured shoulder, making the big man roar. "You should have just stayed in Kansas," Cain snarled, closing his hands around Caleb's windpipe. Caleb couldn't get a breath. Cain's grip was like iron, a practiced hold. These hands had done this before. The world began to fade to black, and then Maggie was right there. She pushed the cold barrel of the revolver against the back of Virgil Cain's head. Her hand was steady. Her voice was pure ice. "Let him go." Cain's grip eased up. Not by much, but it was enough for Caleb to drag in some air. "You're not going to pull that trigger," Cain wheezed. "You're not a killer, Maggie." "You're right about that. I'm not. But you taught me a lesson out on that trail, Virgil. You taught me just what I'm willing to do to see another sunrise." She pulled back the hammer. The click was the loudest thing in the whole world. Cain let go of Caleb's neck and slowly put his hands up. Caleb scrambled away, gulping for air, and grabbed for Cain's dropped pistol. He got it in his hand, aimed it at Cain's chest, and finally let himself take a full breath. "On your stomach," Caleb ordered, his voice raw. "Hands behind your back." "This ain't over," Cain said, but he was lowering himself to the dirt. The fight was seeping out of him as blood poured from his shoulder. "Colton will send others. He ain't ever gonna stop." "Yes, he will," Maggie said. She still had the revolver leveled at Cain's head. Her arm was shaking now, not from being scared, but from the agony of her cracked ribs pulling with every muscle. "Because first thing in the morning, every last piece of proof I've collected is going straight to a federal investigator, and your boss is going to rot in a prison cell for the rest of his days. You think some papers are going to stop a man like Douglas? Paper has put away men worse than Douglas. And the sworn testimony from that dying man over there in the barn is going to be the final nail in his coffin." She finally lowered the gun, her arm just giving out. "Caleb, tie him up." Caleb found some rope on the porch rail and used it to bind Cain's wrists and ankles. The man put up no fight. The wound in his shoulder was bleeding something fierce, and not even Virgil Kane could argue with that. The blood loss was finishing the job that Caleb's fists and Maggie's bullets had started. Once Kane was tied up tight, Caleb went over to Maggie. She was slumped on the porch steps with the revolver resting in her lap, her entire body trembling. The adrenaline was gone, and now everything else, the pain, the fear, the bone-deep weariness was flooding in. "You shot him," Caleb said, stating the obvious. "I shot him left-handed in the pitch dark from 40 feet away. I was aiming for his heart. I got his shoulder instead." A weird noise came out of her, half a chuckle and half a sob. "Douglas always did say I had a tendency to pull to the left." Caleb sat down next to her. The barn was completely swallowed by the fire now, lighting up the yard like a fake sunrise. Garrett was on the ground nearby, out cold but still breathing. Kane was tied up and bleeding out, and the two of them just sat on the steps, beat up and wrung out, watching the blaze consume everything Caleb had put in that barn. "Well, there goes all my hay for the winter," Caleb said quietly. "I'll get you some new hay." "And with what money?" "I used to be a bank teller. I'll find a way." He looked at her then, all bruised and broken, covered in soot and grime, with a gun in her lap and a fire in her eyes that could rival the one in the barn. And for all of it, for the sharp pain in his ribs and the burns on his hands, and the fact that his barn was gone and a murderer was hogtied in his yard, he felt a spark he had not felt in 3 long years. He felt truly alive. "Maggie?" "What?" "When all this is said and done, don't," she held up her good hand, "don't you dare say something heartfelt right now. I'm running on nothing but pure fury and terror, and if you say one kind thing to me, I am going to shatter into a million pieces." "All right, I'll tell you later when you're ready to hear it." "Deal." The sound of horse hooves coming up the south road at a full gallop. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, Kane's revolver ready. Maggie raised hers too. They were moving together now, a team that had been forged in one single night of fire and violence. "Hold on now," a voice called out. "It's Yates. I got Tom and a couple of deputies with me." Sheriff Yates rode into the yard lit by the fire and reined his horse in hard. He stared at the burning barn, the man tied up on the ground, and the 2 figures on the porch, blackened by smoke and holding guns. "Good Lord Almighty," he breathed. "What in the world happened here?" "Virgil happened," Caleb said. "He's over there, tied up, with a bullet in his shoulder. There's another fella named Will Garrett by the barn, shot in the gut. He worked for Colton, but he's ready to talk. And I'd surely appreciate it if your deputies could throw some water on that fire before it takes my house, too." Yates swung down from his horse, barking out orders. His deputies grabbed blankets and buckets from the well and ran toward the fire. Tom rushed over to Caleb, his face pale as a ghost. "Boss, are you all right?" "I'm fine. Go check on Garrett. Just keep him breathing." Yates walked over to Kane and crouched down to look him over. Kane glared up at the sheriff with pure disdain. "You're making a big mistake, lawman. Douglas Colton will bury this whole town." "Maybe so, but you won't be here to watch it happen." Yates stood up and faced Caleb. "Heard the gunshots from down the road. We were already on our way out when we saw the glow from the fire." He looked over at Maggie. "Ma'am, are you the one who shot this man?" "Yes, sir, I am." "Good." He tipped his hat to her. "Saved me the trouble." The sun came up slow and gray. The barn was just a smoldering pile of ruin, but the house was untouched. Garrett was alive, just barely, stretched out on the kitchen floor while Tom pressed a cloth to his wound. Kane was locked down in the root cellar, hands and feet bound, his shoulder crudely bandaged by a deputy who wasn't too worried about being gentle. Caleb sat at the kitchen table as Maggie cleaned the burns on his hands with fresh water and torn strips of cloth. Her busted fingers made the job clumsy and painful for her, but she wouldn't let anyone else near him. "Hold still," she muttered when he winced. "That burns." "Good. Maybe next time you won't go running headfirst into a burning building." There was a man trapped in there, and there was another man out here trying to put a bullet in you. You could have been killed. So could he. He was one of the men who beat me half to death, Caleb. I know. And you still told me to save him. You still wanted to hear what he had to say. You could have let him burn to a crisp, and no one would have said a word against you. He took her wrist gently in his unbandaged hand. That's not weakness, Maggie. That is the single strongest thing I have ever seen a person do. She stopped her work and just looked at him. Her one good eye was bloodshot, and you could see the exhaustion etched into her face. But something about her had changed since the night before. The fear was still in there, buried way down deep, but it wasn't running the show anymore. I didn't do it for him, she said softly. I did it because if I had let a man die just to save my own skin, I wouldn't be any better than Douglas. You are nothing like Douglas. I know that now. She finished wrapping up his hand and tied the cloth securely. But I didn't know it before. Ruth showed up with the first light of day, carrying food, clean bandages, and a temper that could strip paint off a wall. She took one look at the burned-out barn, the prisoner locked in the cellar, and Caleb's bandaged hands. Then she spun on Sheriff Yates. Emmett Yates, you gave me your word you were going to keep this ranch safe. I got here as quick as I could, Ruth. Not quick enough. Just look at them. She pointed a finger at Caleb and Maggie. They look like they've been through a war. They have. And they won. Ruth's anger seemed to cool a bit. She looked at Maggie, sitting there at the table with ash in her hair, and a revolver she still hadn't set aside. And in that moment, something silent passed between the two women. It was recognition. It was respect. It was the kind of deep understanding that doesn't need any words. You're the one who shot him, Ruth said. It wasn't a question. Left-handed, Maggie replied. That's my girl. Ruth set her basket of food on the table and got to their things. Now y'all eat something before you collapse, and then someone can tell me what is next. What was next came riding in at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Hannah Price galloped up the road, her doctor's bag bouncing on her saddle, and a leather satchel held tight to her chest. She was not by herself. Next to her rode a man in a dark coat, a federal marshal's badge glinting in the July sun. Caleb met them in the yard, his bandaged hands limp at his sides. Hannah, I found him in Helena, she said, out of breath as she swung down from her horse. He was already on his way here. Caleb, this is Samuel Harding, a United States federal investigator. Harding dismounted with the smooth motion of someone more comfortable on a horse than on his own 2 feet. He was in his 40s, with a lean face and sharp eyes that took in the burnt barn, the deputies, and the whole state of the ranch in one quick glance. Mr. Mercer, I hear you have had a busy couple of days. That is one way to put it. That is one. I have been building a case against Douglas Colulton for 6 months, Harding said, tracking whiskey, following the money, talking to tribal leaders. But I was missing the one thing to tie it all together, the financial books from the source. He glanced toward the house. I have a feeling Mrs. Colton can help with that. She can. And we have got a man inside who rode with Colulton and is ready to talk. He is shot in the stomach. He needs a doctor. Hannah was already on the move. Where is he? On the kitchen floor. She vanished into the house. Harding followed Caleb onto the porch where Maggie was waiting. She had washed her face and tied her hair back, but nothing could hide the bruises or her splinted fingers. She was clutching Hannah's leather satchel, the same one she had mailed from Missouri, holding it close. Mrs. Colton, Harding said, I have been looking for you for a long time. She simply held out the satchel. It is all in here. 3 months of ledgers, the names of his buyers, the shipment dates, how much they paid, letters between Douglas and his suppliers, and the records of the bribes to local officials who looked the other way. Harding opened the satchel and started going through the papers. His face remained a stone mask, but his hands moved quicker as he flipped through page after page. This is thorough, he said. This is more than thorough, Mrs. Colton. Do you realize what you have done? I realize what it cost me. Harding looked up from the papers. For just a second, his professional calm broke. "Yes, ma'am, I can surely see that." He closed the satchel. "I am riding to Elkbend right now to arrest Douglas Colulton. Sheriff Yates has agreed to help. I would like you to stay here until we make the arrest. It is for your own safety." "I am going with you," Maggie declared. "Ma'am, that is not a good idea. I was not asking for your advice. I spent 3 years terrified of that man. I saw him poison folks for $1. I let him hurt me and convince me it was all my fault. I ran from him and almost paid for it with my life." She pulled herself up straight, wincing as her ribs screamed in protest. "I am going to be there when you put the cuffs on him. I have to see it. I have earned that right." Harding glanced over at Caleb. Caleb just shrugged. "I would save your breath, Mr. Harding. She is not the kind of woman who stays put. I am beginning to see that." Harding almost cracked a smile. "All right, Mrs. Colton, you can ride with us, but you will stay behind me and my men the entire time." "Agreed." Caleb took a step forward. "I am coming along too." Maggie turned to face him. "Your hands are burned, your ribs are busted, so are yours. And you just volunteered to ride straight into town. That is different. How is it different?" She opened her mouth, then shut it, and just shook her head. "You are the most stubborn man I have ever known. The second most stubborn person on this porch, I figure." Ruth appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. "If all of you are riding to town, then I am coming too. Somebody has to make sure you fools do not get yourselves killed before supper time." And so they all rode. Harding and his federal badge took the lead. Yates and his deputies rode on the flanks. Caleb and Maggie rode next to each other, beat up and bandaged, heading toward the man who had tried to ruin her. Ruth Calloway brought up the rear, a shotgun resting across her saddle, and a look on her face that dared anybody to say a word about it. They made it to Elkbend as the long afternoon shadows were stretching out across the main street. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath, like it knew something big was about to go down. Faces peeked out from behind curtains. Doors creaked open just a crack. The blacksmith froze with his hammer in midair. Douglas Colton was sitting on the hotel porch when they rode up. He saw the federal badge first, then the sheriff, and then he saw his wife. His face changed 3 times, quick as a flash. First came surprise, then pure fury, and last something Maggie had never seen on him before. It was fear. "Douglas Colton," Harding announced, swinging down from his horse. "I am federal investigator Samuel Harding. You are under arrest for the illegal sale and distribution of whiskey on protected tribal lands, for fraud, for conspiracy, and for being an accessory to assault. Stand up and show me your hands." Douglas did not move. He looked right past Harding, past the deputies, and his eyes locked on Maggie. His voice sounded tight and strangled. "You did this." Maggie met his gaze from her saddle. She did not tremble, did not flinch, and did not look away. "Yes," she said, "I did." Douglas Colton got to his feet slowly from the hotel chair. His eyes stayed glued to Maggie's face. The charm he usually wore like a fine coat was gone, stripped right off him. What was left was the man she had lived with when no one else was looking. A man who was cold, calculating, and dangerous. "Margaret, you have no idea what you have just done." "I know exactly what I have done. These charges are not going to stick. I have lawyers. I have powerful friends in Washington. This whole thing will be thrown out before it ever sees a courtroom. Your lawyers cannot unwrite the words in your own ledgers, Douglas. Your friends in Washington cannot make 3 months of shipping records disappear, especially with your name signed on every last page." Maggie's voice was as steady as a rock. "And your man, Virgil Kane, is currently sitting in a root cellar with a bullet in his shoulder, just waiting to tell a federal court everything you told him to do." The blood drained from Douglas's face. Virgil would never talk. "Virgil shot one of your own men and left him for dead. That man is alive, by the way. And he is also ready to talk." She leaned forward a little in her saddle. "It is over, Douglas. The only choice you have left is whether you walk to that jail with your head held high or if these men have to drag you there." Douglas's hand twitched toward his coat. In an instant, 3 rifles and a shotgun were pointed squarely at his chest. It was Harding, Yates, a deputy, and Ruth Calloway, who apparently was not bluffing about that shotgun. "I would not do that," Harding said in a calm voice. Douglas froze. His eyes darted from one gun to the next, calculating his chances, the same way he calculated his profits. The numbers were not in his favor. His hand fell back to his side. "Peter!" he called out to the man standing behind him in the hotel doorway. "Go get my lawyer." Peters did not budge. He looked at the badges, at the guns, and at Maggie's bruised and swollen face, and he made a quick calculation of his own. "I think I will be getting my own lawyer, Mr. Colton." He took a step back with his hands up. "Deputy, I would like to cooperate." "Smart man," Yates grumbled. Just like that, the fight drained right out of Douglas. It did not happen slowly. It happened all at once, like a rope being cut. His shoulders sagged, his jaw went slack, and for just a second, standing there on that hotel porch in handcuffs, he looked at Maggie with what seemed like real confusion. "I gave you everything," he said. "A home, a name, respect in this community. Why was that not enough for you?" Maggie slid down from her horse. Everything hurt. Everything. But she walked to the bottom of those steps and looked up at the man she had married 4 years ago. The man who had won her over with flowers and sweet words. The man who had hit her for the first time on a Tuesday night because his dinner was cold. "You gave me a cage, Douglas, and you called it a home because the bars were covered in gold." She took a step back. "I hope you think about that when you are sitting in a cell with bars that are just plain iron." Harding took Douglas by the arm. "Mr. Colton, you are being transported to Helena for your arraignment. I suggest you use the long ride to think about your choices." As the deputies led Douglas away toward the jail, the town of Elkbend slowly came back to life. Doors that had been cracked now swung wide open. People started to step out onto the street. Miller from the general store, the blacksmith, women wiping their hands on their aprons with children hiding behind their skirts. They had all been watching from the shadows, and now they came out with the careful relief of folks who have just watched a bad storm pass them by. An older woman came up to Maggie. It was Martha Kessler, the woman who ran the boarding house. She had never said a word to Maggie before, had no reason to, but she walked right up with tears on her wrinkled face and took Maggie's good hand in both of her own. "My sister," Martha said, "back in Ohio. Her husband was just like that. She never got away." She gave Maggie's hand a firm squeeze. "God bless you, child, for getting away." Then another woman came up to her, and then another. Each one had a quiet word, a gentle touch on the arm, a nod that said everything. It was not pity. It was something stronger than pity. It was understanding. The kind of understanding that comes from women who knew exactly what Maggie had survived because they had seen it, or lived it, or loved someone who had not made it out. Ruth stood right beside Maggie through it all. She kept one hand on her shoulder, as steady as an anchor. "You see that?" Ruth said in a low voice. "That is what courage does. It pushes open doors that other people were too scared to even touch." Caleb watched the whole thing from his horse, giving her the room she needed. This moment did not belong to him. It belonged to Maggie and to these women, and to whatever was passing between them that he could see but never truly understand. When the street finally emptied out and the heavy jail door slammed shut on Douglas Colton, Maggie turned and found Caleb still there. He was just waiting, patient and quiet, his bandaged hands resting on the reins. He had not complained once about his own cracked ribs, and he was just watching her with those kind brown eyes, the first kindness she had seen when she woke up in the dirt. "You stayed," she said. "I told you I would. You stayed on your horse at a distance. You let me face him myself. It was not my fight to finish. It was yours." She walked over to his horse and looked up at him. Take me home, Caleb. He reached down with his bandaged hand. She took it with her broken one, and neither of them even flinched. The ride back to Pine Ridge was quiet. It was not the tense, heavy silence of the past few nights, but a different kind. It was an empty kind of silence. The silence you feel after a bad fever finally breaks. The silence of a body that is finally letting itself rest. Hannah met them when they got to the ranch. Garrett was stable. She had worked on him for hours, and his chances had gone from none at all to maybe. Kane was still locked in the root cellar, with a deputy standing guard until he could be taken to Helena. He will live to see a trial, Hannah said, talking about Garrett. Whether he lives much past that will depend on how well he heals and how truthful he is when he gets on that witness stand. He will be honest, Maggie said. He's been carrying around the guilt from the day he watched Virgil hurt me. Facing death has a way of clearing a man's conscience. Next, Hannah looked both of them over. Caleb's ribs were cracked too on his right side from where Kane had kneed him. His hands were burned but would heal up fine without any lasting damage. Maggie's old injuries had not gotten any worse, though Hannah noted with a doctor's disapproval that her patient had clearly ignored all medical advice about getting rest. You were supposed to stay in bed for 2 weeks, Hannah reminded her. I was busy. You were shot at, got caught in a fire, and then you rode 6 miles on a horse with 4 broken ribs. Like I said, busy. Hannah just shook her head, but she could not hide the look of admiration in her eyes. You are the worst patient I have ever had, and you are the best doctor I have never taken the time to thank properly. Maggie reached out and took Hannah's hand. You kept those papers safe. You rode all through the night. You were the one who brought Harding. None of this would have happened without you. I am a doctor. Saving people is just part of the job. This was more than the job, and you know it. Hannah held her gaze for a moment, then gave a single sharp nod. You are welcome, Maggie. That evening they all gathered in the kitchen. Caleb, Maggie, Ruth, Hannah, and Tom. 5 people who just a week ago were strangers or close to it, were now tied together by something stronger than chance. Ruth cooked, because that is what Ruth always did, and feeding folks was how she made sense of the world. Tom set the table with the careful focus of a young man who had just discovered how fast a life could turn upside down. Hannah poured coffee and checked on her patients between bites, never quite able to stop being a doctor. And Caleb and Maggie just sat next to each other, not touching, not talking, just sharing the same space in the quietest, most powerful way. What is going to happen now? Tom asked, breaking the comfortable silence. With the trial and everything. Harding will put together the federal case, Caleb explained. With Maggie's papers, Garrett's testimony, and whatever Peters confesses, Douglas will be tried in Helena. It could take months. And Kane? Ruth asked. Attempted murder, arson, assault. Caleb's voice went hard as iron. He will never see the outside of a cell again. What about the whiskey operation? Hannah asked. The people being poisoned on the reservations. Maggie put down her cup. Harding told me the army is already on its way to shut down the supply lines. The tribal council has been helping them. It will not fix the harm that has been done, but it will stop it from getting any worse. Because you spoke out, Ruth said, her voice firm. Do not you ever forget that. There are people alive right now because Maggie Colton decided she would not just look the other way. Maggie looked down at her hands. One was splinted, the other was scarred, but both were still hers. I almost did not do it. So many times I almost kept my mouth shut. I almost told myself it was not my business. I almost believed Douglas when he swore nobody would ever listen to me. But you did not stay quiet, Caleb said softly. No, I did not. Why? She thought about the real answer, not the one she had practiced. Because I could not stop thinking about the people at the end of those shipments. The families, the children. People who would never even know my name, but whose lives were being ruined by something I could stop. She looked over at Caleb. And because somewhere on that long road between Missouri and Montana, I decided that if I was going to die one way or another, I would rather die as someone I could respect. The kitchen fell silent. Ruth dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her apron. Tom stared hard at his empty plate. Hannah cleared her throat and poured more coffee for nobody in particular. Caleb reached across the table and took Maggie's hand right there in front of everyone. "You told me to wait," he said to her. "To say it later when you could really hear it. I remember. Is this later enough for you?" She looked down at their hands joined together on the table. A scarred wooden table. His burned hands and her broken ones were both on the mend. He said, "Yes. I am not a man who uses fancy words, Maggie. I am just a rancher whose barn was burned to the ground with a past I spent 3 years trying to outrun. I cannot promise that you will be safe because last night showed I cannot even protect my own place, and I surely cannot promise you a perfect life because I have no idea what one of those even looks like." She whispered, "I do not want perfect. Good. Because here is what I can promise. I will never lay a hand on you. I will never make you feel like you are less than. I will never tell you to be quiet when you have something to say. And I will stand right beside you, not out front, not lagging behind, but beside you for as long as you will have me." Ruth shot up from her chair, grabbing Tom by the arm. "The kitchen is closing. Everybody get out." "But I have not finished my—" Tom began to argue. "Out now. Hannah, you as well. I was just going to check on—" "You can check it tomorrow. These two need some space." The kitchen was empty in a heartbeat. The door swung shut, and then it was only Caleb and Maggie, their hands still joined on the table with the warm lamplight between them. "Beside me," Maggie repeated, her voice soft. "Beside you. Not because I need you to protect me, but because I just plain need you. There is a big difference." She raised his bandaged hand and gently pressed her lips to his knuckles right over the burns. "I need you too. And that thought scares me more than Virgil Caine ever did. Why is that? Because Caine could only hurt my body. You could hurt my heart. And I am putting my trust in you not to do that. I will not. I believe you." She said it just like that, with no holding back, none of the careful walls she put up every other time the subject of trust had come up between them. 3 simple words, open and honest. "I believe you." He kissed her then, real gentle, because her lip was still busted and his own ribs were screaming at him for moving. It was a kiss shared between 2 broken people who had found something in each other. It was not about being made whole, but about finding a partner, a special kind of comfort that comes when 2 damaged souls fit together just right. When they finally parted, Maggie was crying. These were not the terrible tears of being betrayed or the hot tears of a fight. They were quiet tears, tears of pure relief. The kind of tears a woman cries when she finally puts down a burden she has carried for so long. She forgot what it felt like to stand up straight. "I am going to need a place to stay," she said, a little laugh mixed in with her tears. "Seeing as how I'm a woman with no home, no job, and a divorce to take care of, I have got a spare room. The same spare room where I have been laid up? That is the one. And how long is a deal like that supposed to last? As long as you want it to. No strings attached, no expectations. You have had more than enough of men making your life choices for you. What if I want to make a decision right this minute? Then you go right ahead and make it." She straightened her shoulders, a move he recognized she made right before doing every hard thing he had seen her do since he first found her. Before she stood up to Caine. Before she rode into Elk Bend. Before she looked Douglas right in the eye. "I want to stay. Not just in the spare room and not as some guest. I want to build something right here with you. A life that belongs to me, to us. One that nobody handed to us and that nobody can ever take away from us. That sounds like a mighty fine plan. It is not a plan. It is a promise. In that case, I accept." That summer stretched out long and warm over the Montana territory. Caleb rebuilt his barn, with Tom and Ruth's nephews helping out, along with about half the men from Elk Bend, who just showed up one day with lumber and nails without even being asked. Maggie took over the books, kept the supplies in order, and quietly turned the finances of Pine Ridge Ranch completely around with the same sharp mind that had once tracked a whole criminal operation through 3 months of fake account books. Her fingers healed up, her ribs knitted back together. The bruises on her skin faded from a dark purple to a pale yellow and then to nothing at all. The bruises on the inside, though, they took a little longer. Some nights she would still wake up with a gasp, her hands searching for a weapon that was not there anymore. And Caleb would just talk to her, keeping his distance, until she told him it was okay. Hannah rode her horse out once a week to check on her, and those visits soon turned into something more than just doctor's calls. They became a real friendship. Two women living in a territory that was not built to make things easy for women, finding a strength and a softness in each other that neither one of them knew they had been missing. Ruth naturally took all the credit. I told Caleb the very day he brought you home that you were going to turn his life upside down. He did not believe me, of course. Men never do. Douglas Colulton's trial was held in Helena that October. The proof against him was just overwhelming. There were Maggie's documents, Garrett's testimony, Peter's full cooperation, and a money trail that snaked all the way from Missouri to Montana, touching on a dozen corrupt officials along the way. He was found guilty on every single charge and got a sentence of 20 years of hard labor. He never once looked over at Maggie during the whole trial. She, on the other hand, looked at him the entire time. Virgil Kane got a sentence of life in prison for attempted murder, setting the fire, and conspiracy. When the judge read the sentence, he stared straight at Maggie across the courtroom with that cold little smirk she knew all too well. She just stared right back at him until he was the one who had to look away. He looked away first. Garrett made it through. He ended up serving 2 years for his role in the whole conspiracy, and the day he got out, he sent a letter to Pine Ridge Ranch. It was a short note. It said, "Mrs. Mercer, I do not deserve for you to forgive me, and I am not asking you to. But I wanted you to know that your courage changed the entire direction of my life. I am trying now to be the man I should have been back on that trail. Will Garrett, Mrs. Mercer." Maggie read that part over twice. She had married Caleb the spring before, right after her divorce was official and the last of the snow had finally melted. It was just a small wedding right there at the ranch. Hannah was her witness. Ruth cooked enough food to feed 40 people and cried clean through the whole ceremony, all while swearing up and down she was not crying. Tom put on a new shirt and fumbled with the ring he was supposed to be holding, nearly dropping it in the dirt. That made everyone laugh and broke up the seriousness of it all in just the right way. Sheriff Yates even came. He shook Caleb's hand hard, tipped his hat to Maggie and said, "I am mighty glad I stopped being scared of the wrong folks." "So am I, Sheriff," Ruth told him. "So am I." On a warm July evening, 1 year to the day after Caleb had found a broken woman on a dusty trail, they sat together on the front porch of Pine Ridge Ranch. The new barn stood strong against the dark hillside. The horses were grazing peacefully down in the pasture. Tom was out somewhere mending a fence and singing way off key. Ruth had gone home for the night, but not before promising to come back the next day with a pie. Maggie rested her head on Caleb's shoulder. His arm came around her, feeling easy and warm, and she did not pull away. She had not pulled away from his touch in months. That was its own kind of victory. A quiet one, a private one, but a huge one all the same. Caleb H. "Do you remember what you told me that first night you found me? When I told you to just leave me there, you said that was not an option." "I remember. I think about that a whole lot. About what might have happened if you had been a different kind of man, the kind that just keeps on riding. I think about it too. And I thank God every single day that I am not that man." She turned her head to look right at him. Her brown eyes met his gray-blue ones, her scars meeting his scars. Two people who had walked straight through fire, some of it real, and had come out on the other side holding on tight to each other. "I am not the same woman you found on that road," she told him. "No, you are not. That woman was ready to die. And now..." Maggie Mercer looked out over the land that was hers, at the home she had built back up with her own healed hands, at the life she had fought for with busted fingers and a borrowed gun, and a stubborn streak that had proven tougher than every man who had ever tried to break her. Now, I am ready to live. And that is exactly what she did. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.